inventory, right? We hear it everywhere. You hear it from your friends, you hear it online. So John, what are you seeing in the 2 to 4 unit space? And then Brian, what are you seeing in the 5+ unit spaces in terms of the low inventory?
I'll let Brian tee that one off. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah. Thanks, John. I was just talking about this in the breakout room with a few other guys. There's been an imbalance probably the last several years where there's much more demand than supply of properties. And it seems that now, even post-COVID, that has accelerated, certainly in the suburbs as well as the city. And there is just a lot of capital chasing deals. I think there's a few things that have played into that. I think the interest rate environment, obviously, as we all know, rates are very low. Lenders are very aggressive. They've ticked up a little bit in the last few weeks, but still pretty low. There's just a lack of options for other investors that may have historically looked at retail or office or hospitality. And they're like, hey, obviously that's a pretty big question mark right now. Like, let's look at apartments. And I think there's just general optimism for apartments, moving forward. So it's kind of a perfect storm right now. And it's pushing pricing higher and higher. And sellers, I think a lot of people thought about it last year, and then COVID hit, and then they just kind of pulled back. I was just saying this earlier. I think in the next 30, 60 days, hopefully that starts to loosen up a little bit on the supply side. But I think for a variety of reasons, there's just an extreme imbalance that I hope will, balance out a little bit in the next few months. But, I don't really see the demand slowing down, certainly this year, and I think well into next year, assuming economically we, continue on the right track with COVID and everything else that feeds into the economy.
Yeah, it's funny how the 2 to 4 unit space is so similar and so different, right? It's oftentimes a very different buyer than you'd see in commercial real estate. And I think the majority of buyers really are, families, people that want to live in the properties that may or may not be investors. I think a lot of people at this meetup probably are thinking of it in similar terms. Maybe they're figuring out a cash and cash return or a cap rate, but there is low inventory in the 2 to 4 unit space as well. And prices are shooting up fast. We just did a market analysis for a seller last week, and the prices were up like 15.6% from last year, which is pretty insane. So we are seeing much the same thing in that 2 to 4 unit space. That's for sure.
Yeah. Do you think it will improve as far as the supply in the next few months as we go into spring and summer?
I hope so. The hope is that there's a lot of people that have been holding off from selling their properties due to the pandemic. But we're going to be missing all the short sales and foreclosures, which help kind of make up the bottom of the stack of inventory. So I guess it remains to be seen if we really have a big spike. I don't think there'll be a spike in inventory. I think prices will stay pretty tight this year through the rest of the summer. I guess we'll find out.
To piggyback off of that a little bit on the construction end, we're starting to see a little bit of that trickle into our world, where now all of the fuller scopes that we were used to are being reduced down a little bit because of those higher purchase prices. So where we used to see a lot more, call it bathroom, kitchen remodels, full guts, now we're seeing those scopes reduced down to, in some cases, a bare minimum because of those purchase prices. And sellers and buyers having to get a little more creative because of that, as it relates to construction, at least.
So Justin, when you're preparing a multifamily property for sale, what are some of the most impactful renovations that somebody can make to kind of prep for the sale?
Yeah, great question. So the bathroom and kitchen are always going to be the sexiest, I think, where those will probably help sell the property the most. And I don't think I'm telling anybody in this room anything that they don't know. But I always think that there's a lot of value to add when it comes to making sure that you're turning over a relatively maintenance-free property. So whether that's in the 2 to 4 realm or a much larger property, ensuring that you are capturing all of the building items that need to be addressed, because I think it ultimately is going to help the seller a lot to turn over a product or to sell a product that is hands off or relatively maintenance free. I think that's a much more attractive product in my opinion. And I think it's something that's oftentimes overlooked.
Yeah. I think this question could be for all three of you. What types of items might you avoid, like either fixing up if you're planning to sell, that would not make sense to avoid if you're planning on holding?
I'll jump in first if you don't mind, because that one tends to be more obvious for me. A lot of times we'll see clients who are holding will oftentimes want to change their mechanical systems, because that's a little better off for the long-term hold, where you know you're going to get that maintenance-free product that I was talking about. A lot of times when we work with clients who are just in it for the flip, then you may see them focusing more on the cosmetics and the aesthetics than you would the actual mechanics of the property.
Yeah.
I think in a 2 to 4 unit space, where you can oftentimes cheat a little bit, for lack of a better word, would be maybe you have older furnaces. Plumbing, a lot of times you can do some work but not do all of it, because it's a lot more expensive to dig it all out. Same thing with electrical. Maybe you can do part of it if it's required by the scope, but you can skip out. I have seen some people try to get away with older roofs. That normally doesn't go very well in residential, because I feel like most inspectors, that's like a big, like on the Google of the 5 things to have your inspector look for, roof is like number 1, 2, and 3. So that normally doesn't go well. But in the contract we use for the residential stuff, there's verbiage about older mechanicals are considered to be fine. You really can't ask for a lot of credits. So I think that's one place you can make some tough decisions on your budget when you're kind of getting ready.
Plumbing and electric, especially to John's point, plumbing and electric are mechanics where you will have to open the walls 9 times out of 10 to make those upgrades. And that's when it becomes a little more costly. So I think that's where we see sellers pulling back a little bit to not want to spend that money, because plumbing and electric or anything within the wall will oftentimes drive the scope into a much fuller scope.
Yeah, I think this question and the previous question are pretty closely related. On the larger stuff, the buyers of the 12 plus unit properties, they typically have a very good understanding of what they're doing and how things operate. And in our experience, they prefer, to Justin's point, I call them the bigger ticket items, like the boiler, hot water tank, electric. They prefer that those things are in good shape, the roof, the plumbing, whereas the units, that's easy for them. That's very easy for them to wrap their head around, kitchens, baths, flooring, paint, trim, whatever else. That's easy and that's predictable. Whereas when they go in and we don't really have a good idea the age of the mechanicals, like that brings about some hesitation, and they're not going to be as confident buying that property. So if you are thinking about selling, I think this probably relates in the 2 to 4 space as well. It's easy to focus on a kitchen or a bathroom, but I think if you can make sure your bigger items are in good shape for the next guy or girl, don't worry about the units. That's easy for, I think, most people to wrap their head around.
Makes sense. We kind of touched on this one earlier, but what impact are you seeing financing having on sales prices in the current market?
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit from the residential side. So the people that will pay the most for a property are almost always FHA buyers, which a lot of people in here who want the house hack may not want to hear. But the reality is FHA normally pay the top dollar. So cash normally pays the lowest, right? And conventional somewhere in between. So with the interest rates being ridiculously low, I think that is pushing prices higher and higher. We've seen multiple people on the buy side closing on properties with interest rates in the 2s. And that is insanely low. And whether it's sustainable or not, I have no idea, but it's definitely going to influence prices on residential properties. So if you're selling, you should be aware of what kind of interest rate buyers can get. And that definitely plays a huge part into what kind of price you can get. So for instance, if you're trying for top dollar, you have to keep those FHA and VA loan people in mind. maybe if you're single family, the low down payment conventional, 3% down conventional, because they are typically the ones that pay the highest price. Again, it's just from a broad perspective.
Yeah, I think in the commercial space, yeah, we were kind of talking about this earlier. The lenders have been very aggressive. Certainly the community banks, like your Wintrust, West Suburban Bank, Bank of Forest Park, all those guys they love multifamily. It's something that they're comfortable with. They think it's safe. And they are, willing to get aggressive for, the right deal and the right borrower. The agencies, Fannie and Freddie, which we deal a lot with, certainly with the larger properties, they've also been very aggressive. They've pulled back some of their construction financing, so you have to get some sort of bridge product. But for permanent financing, which is more of an acquisition loan or a construction loan, they have been pretty aggressive on both of those recently. I think I've seen, the construction loans, which are a little bit more risky, as high as 80-85% loan to cost, and then still have a rate that floats, but still around 4%. Whereas it used to be 75% loan to cost and something in the fives. And then for your acquisition loan, they are still in the threes, mid to high threes, and they'll go up to 75%, potentially 80% of your acquisition, depending on the deal and the borrower. So everyone's been very aggressive across the board. And obviously the lower your borrowing costs are, the more you can pay for a property.
Nice.
Justin, how much does financing impact your business, or how much are you maybe aware of how construction financing is impacting, the people who are hiring you, their decision?
Yeah, good question. I think, we definitely saw a pause in that last year or over the past year or so. I would say certainly less financing than what we're used to. Ultimately, I don't think it affects me personally or our business too much. We've seen a lot of 203Ks opportunities come through. Those tend to be a bit tricky because I think they're typically a reduced scope that's not necessarily a great fit for a bigger GC. And I think that's where a lot of clients struggle with finding the right type of contractor for that type of financing. It really just, it varies for us, and it ultimately doesn't necessarily affect me that much.
All right. Next up, what are some gotchas you see where investors make big mistakes and lose money? So any of the three of you. On the selling side in particular, we'll focus on that. John, you got one?
I was going to say, I'll let Justin go on the ways that people,
I
know, I was just thinking about this question as an interesting one. Justin, what are some ways people like me make mistakes where we get in over our head with the scope? Because I know early on you saved me on a deal where my scope was all over the place.
Yeah, it's largely that. It's largely identifying the correct scope for the project in terms of what's going to make the most sense for your project, and then being able to execute it. And I think a lot of owners, especially in that smaller space, they call it 2 to 4 unit space, oftentimes think of themselves as a GC where they can open up the phone book and call a plumber, an electrician, and try to start to piece this together a little bit. And in reality, that's not always the case. There's a reason our job exists, and it's to be able to execute that scope in a timely manner. And I always joke, and the same joke I make to you, John, is how much do you value your time? And I think that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that we see. And I think that's what you're alluding to, John. That's one of the biggest mistakes that we'll see clients make, trying to GC the project for themselves with little to no experience. And that certainly wasn't the case with you, because I think you have really great experience. But I would say that's one of the bigger mistakes that we see. And then, over scoping and under scoping as it relates to just, again, choosing the right scope for that type of project. is critical to buying or selling.
What part does the permitting process play for you when you're working with people, Justin? Maybe in the city versus the suburbs, because you work all over the city.
Sure.
So people are like prepping their property. They're going to do some renovations. They're flipping units, whatever. What are some of the gotchas you run into kind of related to that?
Yeah, great question. Permitting and violations for me. I think violations can oftentimes be a bigger gotcha than permits, where a lot of times somebody will buy or sell a property without fully understanding the violations that exist on that property. And I mean, John, we're dealing with it at your building right now at Roosevelt and Cicero, where there are a set of violations that are ultimately going to drive that scope. And I think there are a lot of buyers who will jump into something without necessarily fully understanding that. And then as it relates to permitting, there's always, I think everybody thinks that there's some gray area within permitting, and typically there is. But I think permitting will drive the scope a bit too. That can certainly tack on costs to the job, where you may be, you're more or less at the inspector's mercy, right? Or at the village's mercy, or at the city's mercy, where it's subject to field inspection. Oftentimes that translates to additional costs. And that goes for selling and buying, where typically if there's a permit involved, I think you can count on some additional costs involved. And I would say a lot of times owners don't necessarily count on that, or count on the fullest scope involved with what a permit entails or could entail.
Brian, what are some of the gotchas you see when people are selling commercial real estate?
Yeah, the physical stuff is huge, right? I mean, talking to somebody like Justin, walking through a property, making sure, your scope is
diligence
close to what Justin says it should be. Certainly having a contingency, because once you open up those walls, we all know it could be a challenge. I think on the financial side is rent projections. When you are underwriting a deal and it's like, all right, if I have Justin or somebody similar come in here and update this unit, how much can I push rents? I think you should really, really dig into the rent. Like rent comps are huge. Rental survey, even more so now with the moratoriums and your limitations. You can't guarantee that tenant is going to leave when their lease is up. So factor that in. I was saying this earlier, I think we're starting to see rents increase a little bit now that COVID is starting to get into a better spot, but certainly have seen buyers get a little too aggressive on their pro forma rents, and then they can't hit the value that they were expecting on the back end. So that's rents, and then also expenses, taxes, talk to a tax attorney to make sure that you're fairly in line with what they expect taxes, the growth rate of taxes. Utilities are pretty straightforward. And then also, repairs and maintenance, your management fees. So just your overall income and expense pro formas, your projections, drill into those as much as you can. And that really just comes from experience underwriting, as many deals as we all do, talking to brokers like John or myself. Hey, what do you expect for a building this size with this sort of heating system, et cetera. So I think on the financial side, it's definitely, not getting, overzealous, I should say, with your projections.
Your turn, John.
I feel like it's, the residential space is a little bit different in regards to the way the rents impact the values. They're important, but they're not quite as critical as they would be in commercial, because really your value is loosely tied to rents, but not 100% tied to rents. It's really comparable sales driven. So as you're looking at the market, that's one of the things. I guess one of the biggest gotchas we've seen recently is people that are going under contract at really high prices, especially with FHA, and they're not aware of what can happen with that appraisal. The FHA appraisal sticks with the property. I believe it's for 6 months. So if something goes wrong in that appraisal, you are stuck not being able to go back to that same buyer pool, which is the main buyer pool who pays top dollar. So that's one of the gotchas I've seen quite a bit recently. The other one, especially in 2 to 4 units that I see, is people that will sign a bunch of leases right before they go to market, or they will not think through how this is going to impact their tenants and how their tenants can impact the sale. You almost have to think about aligning yourself with your tenants, you know, a multifamily transaction, especially a duplex, triplex, quad, because, you know, when that inspector shows up, the first thing they're going to do is talk to the tenant. And yeah, thinking through that whole scenario, you know, like what would the next buyer want out of these tenants? Yes, this person's been a great person for you for 10 years and you'd love to have them on a 3-year lease so they can stay in their home, but that may impact the next person's ability to get a loan. So I'd say those are some of the things I see come up quite often in the 2 to 4 unit space, you know, especially in regards to tenants.
I think too, if you want to attract an FHA buyer, having at least one vacant unit, if that's your goal, right? So that there's a unit they can move into.
Essential, right? At least somebody on month to month, so you can do it, you know, follow the loan and do it correctly. Yeah, it's got to be a way for an FHA buyer to get the property. Otherwise, you're excluding them when they go to buy it.
Cool. Should we take questions from the group?
Yeah, that's mostly what we wanted to cover. So yeah, we have a couple people who threw things in the chat. We can start there. This one's more directed towards Justin, I think, although certainly it affects all of us. This is from Mark. Where do windows fall into the discussion or the decision when you're doing renovation? When would you do the windows? And I know Justin and I always diverge here, so this is a fun one.
Yeah, I think a lot of that depends on the age and the quality of the windows. That's always something that I'll immediately look at when I go to look at a property on the front end. Some of it comes down to personal preference. Some of it comes down to actual R&M and maintenance. For me, you know, it's if you've got traditionally, if you have windows that are older than 15 to 20 years old, we're going to be looking to replace those. A lot of times the hardware, the labor associated with the repairs to those windows ends up being almost a wash with replacing them with new windows. I typically err on the side of replacing the window if we're going to have to make extensive repairs. But that's not to say that if a window is 5 to 10 years old, we can't go through and make the necessary repairs. And if they're good windows and they've been maintained, then chances are they'll last for another 5 to 10 and maybe longer, depending on what type of window it is. So I think that's case by case. That it really is, especially with windows. I don't know if that's helpful or not. That's a tough one.
Another question that came in on the chat during this was, with this being such a strong market, does it make sense to just get in and get out, make your flip and get out? And this, Brian, you know, go ahead and answer this from the commercial side, and I can come back to it from the residential side.
Yeah, I think for the larger properties, that can be difficult because there is so much work involved. If you have at least 12, 20 units, that's going to take a while for that to turn over. I think you legally have to, or you should let the leases run out. Again, going back to the eviction moratorium, I don't know how quickly you can move. The whole idea of value add is kind of come into question with these moratoriums that are in place. So it's tough on the larger side. That said, the demand I don't think is going to diminish for properties anytime soon. So if you start tomorrow on a project and it takes you a year to turn things around, I think it could still work. But you got to be careful on the buy. That's like they said, you make all your money on the buy. So I would caution getting too aggressive on the buy where you're, getting at the top of the market, because there is really no way of knowing if the market is going to continue to keep going. Because, I could go on for a while about this, but interest rates, there's a chance that those go up, and I don't think anytime soon, but maybe sometime in 2022. And just because there's talk of inflation with all this money that they're putting out into the economy, and if inflation starts to get out of control, the Fed, the one way they can kind of slow that down is increase rates. So that would therefore put downward pressure on pricing. So it's tough to really know, obviously, what's going to happen here in the future. But I would be careful. If you do find a deal, yeah, go for it. I think whether or not you want to hold or you want to flip it, just be careful to not go in at the top of the market expecting the market to continue to accelerate.
This is interesting on the 2 to 4 unit side, where this is a mistake that I have told many of my clients I've made in the past. I always think like a rental property investor. And sometimes, especially 2 units, it makes a lot more sense to get in and get out. And I actually saw one property a couple years back where I passed it over with a client, told him it was a bad deal. Somebody else went in and put some lipstick on it, did some kitchens, not a bunch of work, and they made quite a bit of money. And it was instructive for me. I think that if you are, traditionally, if you're a buy and hold investor, you should always think about looking through the other lenses. I think the same thing for flippers. You should always think about all the different ways you could make money. So when you have a good deal, think about all the different exits as much as you possibly can from, even potentially wholesaling, right? I've never wholesaled, but there might be a time where that tool will be in my tool belt. Knowing how to flip it, knowing how to hold it, knowing how to cash out refinance it. There's just so many ways to move your money around. Do 1031 exchange. Yeah, definitely this is not a bad time if you come across, especially a vacant property, to get in and get out quickly and do the old lipstick on a pig renovation, as they say.
As related to that too, there are certain types of buildings that will lend themselves to getting in and out of more quickly. Anything that call it California style, 60s style, 70s style, is likely to have better mechanics that probably won't need to be upgraded and won't be as much of a source of a headache. So I think properties like that, especially in that 2 to 4 realm, are typically easier to get in and out of, rather than a property that is very common in that world is the 100-year-old walk-up. That type of problem is, if you're looking at it for a good price, that type of property, is more likely to lend itself to bigger spend and being in it a little bit longer than something that's a little newer, where you don't necessarily need to touch the mechanics.
Yeah, I think it's also just, this kind of ties back to the original supply and demand, where if you get in and get out really quickly, don't think that there's another deal that will fit your criteria once you close on the first one. So it's tough. You got to do what makes sense for you. Obviously there's risk in all of this. But if the deal is out there, go for it.
We had another great question that might lend itself more towards Justin. Just generally, what are some quick tips you would give people, things that people don't know because they don't have the amount of data you have, maybe related to flooring or glazing tubs versus not glazing tubs? What are some things that come to mind that the average investor just hasn't done 7,000 times like you have because of your position at Modus?
Sure. I appreciate that. That's something that I could talk about all night, and by all means, feel free to shoot me an email and give me a call. John has all of my contact information. I'm happy to talk about this stuff as much as anybody has time. So, for me, the biggest takeaway is actually as it relates to some of the things that we've been talking about here, where if I have the opportunity to do something, call it right the first time, versus put a Band-Aid on it. We now, and I'm coming from Pangea Properties. That is my core business, and we own and operate nearly 14,000 rental units. So we definitely do have the operating data here. And I've been with the company for 10 years now, and have really helped grow it on the construction side, and have seen a lot of this. And I think in most instances, we've learned that if we are in a situation where we have the opportunity to make the upgrade, say it's a vacant tier or it's a vacant building, we would 9 times out of 10 want to make those upgrades while we can, those mechanical upgrades, because that the expenses associated with the maintenance from not making those upgrades when we had the opportunity will far outweigh the costs that we saved on the front end by saving something like a plumbing riser or a kitchen drain, and being more specific, things like that, right? Like a lot of times you can save your 4-inch cast iron stack in the bathroom because it doesn't take the kind of wear and tear that a kitchen drain might take. A kitchen drain is usually going to be completely deteriorated. If you're getting into the scope of plumbing, I would highly recommend you start with your supply lines and your kitchen drain. Realistically, if you're doing that, you probably might want to consider doing everything. John, I mean, you could probably steer this in a more precise direction for me, because I could talk about any category here.
Oh, that's all right. Some of the stuff that everybody does might be things that you and I just actually had to go through, which is like flooring and painting. I feel like no
Sure.
matter what level you're at, you're going to have to choose maybe paint, what kind of paint, what paint schemes, what types of floors, like
Sure.
you just introduced me to glue down vinyl, which like has blown my world.
Yeah, and it's with something like that, it's a matter of finding somebody who knows how to install it properly. And with paint, we're always going to look for something, and that is largely because we hold the properties. We're always going to look for the most maintenance-free solution. But I think that could relate to sellers as well, because I think it's something that ultimately, if it's a rental property, and Brian can speak to this too, it's something that everybody is looking for. So whether we're talking about paint in an eggshell finish versus a flat finish, or whether we're talking about installing vinyl plank, which might cost me $3.50 a square foot labor and material, versus carpet, which may cost me $1.50 a square foot labor and material, I'm going to opt for the vinyl plank because you're more likely to have to replace that carpet turn after turn, or every other year, or whatever it might be. So ultimately, when I'm operating on the front end, I'm trying to figure out what's going to keep those maintenance costs down. And as it relates to flooring, I think in those higher traffic areas, the vinyl plank will hold up a little better. Obviously, if you can save the hardwood and refinish it, that will always be my first choice, because not only is it cost effective, but it will hold up better than anything. Paint tends to be a personal preference. A lot of people in a Class A property would probably like flat, two-tone. We like to, in some instances, it can be more maintenance free to paint the entire unit the same color. But again, that all depends a little bit on scope and rent and some other things.
Brian, we had a question come in that I think would be perfect for you. In relationship to the price per unit, are rents going up or down? I guess we're thinking like price to rent ratios. What are you seeing in your world these days?
Yeah, I mean, the rents pretty much stalled, call it, last year. I don't know too many people that were raising rents in 2020, at least the last 9 months of 2020. I think they've increased a little bit in the last even 30 days, maybe 60 days. But I think the pricing has accelerated beyond, like, they're not moving in lockstep. I think the price per unit has increased more than rents. So that's when it gets tricky as far as analyzing a deal. I've been doing this for about 10 years now, and every market is different. But I think 50, 60, 70 a door when I first got into the business, and then it was 80, 90 a door. And now 100 a door seems to be like a new watermark for almost, any suburb, whether it's in Lake County, whether it's down the southwest suburbs, certainly DePage, you're beyond that. So it's just continuing to increase, especially in the workforce housing, the B and C class properties, because they're not building any of those. The only thing that they're building is the A class stuff, not only downtown, but in the suburbs, because they're the only deals that can pencil out for a developer, because they have to charge, the $2.50 a foot. So I think that there's very little supply, and yet there's more and more demand for these properties. So I think the price per unit is accelerating more than rents.
We had another really interesting one come in. This one's probably more towards Justin, although I'm certain Brian and I could probably weigh in on this. How do you get in and out quickly in a vacant building? I guess what are some of the challenges when a building is 100% vacant? Obviously, there's opportunity, but what does that do to your scope?
Well, a vacant building is my ideal scenario, right? John, the building that you and I are working on is not ideal, where it's partially occupied. And you guys could probably speak a little better to the sale of something like that. But for me, a vacant building is perfect because we can get in there and we can work quickly. Whereas in a partially occupied building, there are always going to be, especially if you're getting into heavier upgrades like, you know, the plumbing or the electric, where it depends on units above or below. We can get into a vacant building and work as quickly as possible, and not only just quickly, but and it lends itself to making noise, to demo, to all of the things that I need to be able to do to operate as efficiently as possible. So I would always prefer a vacant building when it comes to construction, and that will always allow me to move as quickly as possible.
So it turns out 73% occupied is not the ideal way to fully renovate a building.
But again,
Surprise.
that all depends on scope, right? If you're working, if it's a lighter cosmetic turn, then vacancy may not matter so much. If it's when you start to get into the heavier, the more mechanical upgrades, where a vacant building is especially beneficial.
One thing I learned from Justin, and this is free, nobody asked this, but plaster is not your friend when you're doing electrical work inside of apartments. So I have learned that one the hard way. That really drives your scope into places you don't want to be really quickly.
You know, and there are always going to be instances, and John's building that we're working on right now is a great example, where you may need to get creative. It's very rare in our world that we're just given the perfect scenario. So oftentimes we do have to get creative. And, you know, in this case, there's a little bit of working around tenants. There's a little bit of potentially moving tenants into the finished unit or working in an occupied unit. And there will always be ways to make something work. And I mean, from my standpoint, though, a vacant building or even a vacant tier, if you're in a classic Chicago walk-up, a vacant tier is great. So,
yeah, as far as vacant buildings in the brokerage world, they're great, you know, certainly for construction, but without any income, it makes it challenging from a financing perspective. So just make sure that, I don't know if you have a hard money lender or some sort of construction loan contact for that to actually happen for you to buy, unless of course you're paying all cash. But that's certainly a challenge when there's no income being generated from the property.
Yeah, we're coming from pretty different perspectives there, I think.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, you know, on the residential side, because of the way financing works and things, I mean, being totally vacant makes our life easy in a lot of ways. Appraisers use the market rent or the in-place rent, whichever is lower. So we can make a strong argument for highest rents. You know, it's easy to show. You don't have any problems. It's really just not tied to the income sales price. So that's the thing that's really nice in that residential space. But so we're getting ready to wrap this up. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I am going to ask everybody to unmute. So feel free. It's going to be like a little bit of a free for all. If you have questions for anybody here, feel free to jump in kind of with your final questions.
I'll ask a question just to kick it off. How do you guys feel about non-conforming units?
And by non-conforming, are we saying illegal non-conforming or legal non-conforming? Because both exist. Are you thinking illegal?
Either, you could address both.
So in my world, legal non-conforming is normal and not a huge deal. Especially in the suburbs, you know, most suburbs have a point of sale inspection where they go through all the apartments. And most of the zoning has changed to become less dense in any kind of suburbs where there's a lot of multifamily. So most buildings that I sell are legal non-conforming. When you get the illegal non-conforming is where it gets tricky. In the city, it's kind of like a look the other way, nobody cares. But in the suburbs, it's not. So I think you have to be really specific about where you are. A lot of city investors get dinged pretty fast when they make their first move to the suburbs. And a lot of suburban investors are probably too scared of, that illegal garden apartment in the city. So that's kind of my overall thought process. But you do have to think very, very carefully about the risks associated with an illegal unit, because there are obviously more risks. So if you're going to go down that road, just remember it is illegal. So
Hey, John, can I ask a question just to clarify? When you say illegal, do you mean pertaining to the various code violations that could potentially come up because let's say the ceiling height isn't high enough, or because this unit is over 400 square feet, there's only one exit, or do you mean per the zoning?
So, I mean, really, again, it depends where you're at, right? So in the suburbs, in the residential space, the village makes the decision. So they're going to send an inspector through, and that inspector is going to say, yep, this is legal. And whether or not it meets all these codes, it's grandfathered in. The city is a different beast. So, I mean, it's very situational. And this is where you want to have a good team, in my mind. And if you're looking in an area, you want to make sure your agent, your attorney, like they all know the game on the ground. And if you're going to be doing renovations, be even more wary of that legal non-conforming, because you can do a few things to it and all of a sudden it can become illegal. That can be another trigger. If a building is vacant for more than is 50% vacant for a certain amount of time, there's all these different little things that can come up. So especially as it pertains to selling and construction, I think this is where your team and their expertise and their willingness to dig into your deal becomes so important.
Keep an eye on these ADU pilot programs in the city too. I think you're going to start to see a lot of traction here. Call it in spring, summer with those programs. There's one kicking off here in Rogers Park pretty soon.
So
Yeah,
what about for you, Brian, commercial land? What is a illegal unit look like?
As long as the unit is legal, whether it's through the city or through the village, say you have a 3 flat and you're not sure about the 4th unit, or you have a 12 and you're not sure about the 13th, as long as they're legal, like we can apply value to that unit, and the lender can also identify it as a unit. The rent might be a little bit less because it's a smaller garden, or it's a attic space or something like that. So we may not value it at the same rate as the other units, but the lender and the broker and the buyer, everybody can wrap their head around it and say, okay, this is a legal unit. When it gets tricky, to John's point, is whether if it's an illegal unit that is rented. Now the lender can't identify that as a unit and can't lend on that unit, and we're not going to value it at 100% of its actual value. We won't value it at 0. We'll give it some value. It gets tricky with illegal units because in the city, in some of the suburbs as well, the villages, if that unit is legal, if the buyer tries to legalize it down the road, usually you need to have some parking. It's 1-to-1 sometimes. Now they do have, to Justin's point about the ADU program coming to play, and I think that's going to be pretty popular in the city, where you don't have to add a parking spot if you add a unit. So I can see that certainly start to take off. It's tricky. There's pros and cons to each. I think if it's legal, you should be okay. If it's illegal, just be careful and know what you can expect. Do some research. What you can expect down the line.
Did you say
Justin,
that program was in Rogers Park or Lincoln Park? I'm sorry.
Rogers Park.
The Rogers Park, yeah, and there's a handful of pilot zones throughout the city. The one in Rogers Park is actually separate from what the city has rolled out here. So I would, if that's something you're interested in, you can Google that pretty quickly and see where those. I think there's 5 zones or 6 zones. I can't remember.
Yeah, I'll add a link in the chat.
Yeah.
There is 5 zones, and it's very random how they're drawn out. But I think May 1st they're starting to accept applications.
Michael threw one in there that would be interesting for Justin to answer, which was, how do operators get tenants out of apartments for larger updates like electrical and plumbing? And Justin, I know you're not the guy that gets them out, but I think with Pangea, you may have some experience with that. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have just as good of experience here, at Roosevelt. It's just, I mean, there's a handful there's a handful of strategies. Well, sometimes cash for key is successful. Moving them to moving them to a unit within the building that has recently been turned, moving them if you have the option to another building that's nearby where you may have vacancy to free that up. I mean, depending on the type of turn and how valuable it is to get that unit turned, move them to a hotel for a week, or, you know, in some instances that isn't always sustainable, but it depends on how badly you need to get into that unit to turn it. And honestly, in my experience, a lot of times it is worth whatever you have to do or work out with that tenant to turn that unit, especially if you have, say it's in a classic Chicago walk-up, you have one tenant holding up a tier of 3 units. Then you really start to weigh that a little bit, and it becomes a lot more valuable to get that tenant out of there so that you can get 3 units or 6 units or whatever they might be holding up.
So there's really no market standard. It's also just whatever
Experience,
valuation makes sense.
Matt
I had
had
a
a
quick-
really interesting question. Matt, go ahead if you can unmute yourself and kind of
Yeah,
jump in.
so going back to the illegal unit, what does having a legal unit not allow you to do? Does it not allow you to buy or sell or rent it out or renovate it? What kind of things does it not allow you to do?
So the income does not count as part of your income. So the bank will not consider that as legal income when they're considering your debt to income ratio. When the building's being appraised, you can't have a stove there. So if you do have a stove, you have to get someone to come and like move it out. It depends on the appraiser. If they see it in like a storage, like in the laundry room, they may still report it. Some of them look the other way. It's just you can't claim it on your taxes. You can't claim. Well, you could claim the income, but you can't claim. The bank won't recognize that as legal income is the biggest one because you can't lend against that income.
Brian, when this comes up in the commercial world, what does that look like? You know, you're financing this through your local bank, maybe a wind trust type player. What does that look like? I actually don't have that much experience with illegal units in commercial real estate.
Yeah, the lenders, as we've said, they can't recognize the income. You know, say the $1,000 a month, they can't recognize it. The buyer, you know, they'll discount say it's being sold for 200,000 a unit. They're not going to pay 200,000 a unit for an illegal unit. You know, maybe they pay 100,000 unit, and then the price is just downward. Some buyers are okay with it, and they're just like, you know, this is so popular and it's all over the city that I'll just keep renting it as illegal. And if the city catches me, the city catches me. You know, same thing with the villages. When it gets tough is when you're actually transacting the deal, because so many people are going to be analyzing the property. You know, whether between the lender to the gentleman's point, the lender, the appraiser, the buyer, the broker. You know, if I see them all the time, and when they're most successful is when it's just a long-term hold for the owner and he just operates it that way, and it is what it is. That's what's kind of nice now about this ADU system, or going through the village. And John, you can probably speak to that. I don't really have too much experience with legalizing units in the suburbs. I'm sure it's not easy, but with this ADU program, you're creating a lot of value for these owners. Now it's going to be expensive. I mean, Justin can talk to the costs. Building out a garden unit is not cheap, or a coach house is even more expensive. But you're unlocking all of this potential value, but it's going to, it's going to cost you.
I mean, speaking to legalizing units in today's world, in most of the suburbs that make any sense to invest in, you can't in the burbs. I'm curious to see if that changes though, and Justin might be able to speak to this too. You know, with all these new things in Chicago allowing you to legally redo coach houses and garden units and things like that. I'm wondering, a lot of the suburbs just copycat Chicago in a lot of ways. So it'll be interesting to see if they kind of tag along and allow those to be legalized. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, I know Evanston they've legalized coach houses. I'm not sure about garden units, but coach houses. But it gets pricey, and you got to really look at the math and if it makes sense that the rent you're going to get from that 1 unit or 2 units justifies the cost, because you're looking at new water service, potentially new
Which is
electric
huge.
service. It can get expensive fast. Like,
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of initial
Very.
excitement about it, but as people have talked to contractors and really dug into the numbers, like I have, a 3 flat in the city where a coach house makes a ton of sense, but it's not going to be cheap. So I don't think I'm gonna do it.
Yeah, and I think as this gains popularity, we may see a little bit of relief in that regard to some of the things that you're speaking to, the water service upgrades, electric service upgrades, but that's all speculation at this point. But you are 100% correct right now that it is definitely costly. And that's where I think the people who are the most successful with it are the ones who are going to be able to find 5 at a time, or really maximize it within a building.
Mm-hmm.
To kind of piggyback on that, Justin, when you do a garden apartment, what are some of the things you think about in a garden apartment that you don't have to think about above ground?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there are a lot of variables in a garden. There's the ceiling height, there's drain tile, ejector pit, there's structural concerns, pouring a slab, right? A lot of times these gardens that we see are just they're a dirt pit, right? Or they're old, it's existing hardwood on old sleepers. And at that point, you're taking all that out and re-pouring a slab. And it's, I pay about $8 a square foot to pour concrete. So say it's $1,000, or say it's 1,000 square foot unit, that starts to add up on you, where you've got all these different expenses. Say you're popping in some steel to open it up. That's, you've got 8 in concrete, you've got 3 in steel, you've got another 4 in drain tile. All of a sudden you're looking at 20 grand that you weren't anticipating, or maybe you were, but that you're not spending in a unit above ground.
We probably have time for one more question. If anybody else wants to kind of dive in with the last question, then we're going to need to wrap this one up for tonight.
Hey, hi. My name is Cinto. I just had a really quick question I actually posted to John. How can we as investors improve the value of our properties, especially in anticipation of a refinance? Like, what's the best strategy to optimize?
Brian, you want to take that from the commercial side, because it is a little different, I know, from residential.
Yeah. So on a refi, they're looking more so at the income than the condition of the building. They're going to care less about the age of the mechanicals or the windows, whereas a buyer is certainly going to scrutinize those to a much higher level. So for a refi, you want to get those rents up for those apartments, whether that's forced through rehab or as the leases turn, you increase the rents. But you certainly, from not only a sales income approach, but the income approach that appraisers use, the higher the income, the higher the value. So for a refi, and if you plan on keeping it, I think that's your primary goal, is to get those rents up. But don't completely disregard the mechanicals. If you refi, I assume you're going to keep it for a while. Certainly don't ignore those items either, because those could be costly, as we all know, down the road.
I'm so sorry. I should have clarified. Okay, that was more for commercial, right?
Yeah, I mean, the residential side.
Yeah.
I can speak to that.
Okay,
So
thanks.
let's say you have a 1 to 4 unit. I mean, so they're going to be looking at comparable sales. So this is where your paint, your flooring, your kitchen upgrade, and being very strategic about those things. Maybe if you're just holding on to the property, you're just swapping countertops. You're putting some cheap stainless steel appliances in. You bring the bling, and that will impress the appraiser enough in a lot of cases if you can make your case based on other sales. Obviously, again, the revenue needs to be there too, to some extent, so your debt to income ratio works, but it is not an exact correlation the way a commercial refinance would be. So it really is more about the comparable sales that you can come up with.
And
Hey,
I think
John,
on my end, sorry, that looks like a, you know, a $3,000 to $5,000 turn, right, John? I mean, something like that in terms of the value add.
Yeah, like your paint and carpet turn. Somebody
Exactly.
moves out, you
Yeah,
freshen it. give it the-
countertops, appliances, paint, carpet, whatever it is.
Yeah, no, it's awesome.
Yeah,
I
it's
wanted
just- It's a similar strategy with commercial. I think it's more of a cosmetic upgrade and trying to get those rents up.
So I wanted to kind of wrap this up because I want to be respectful of everybody's time and wanted to especially thank Brian and Justin for coming and spending their Tuesday evening with us tonight. This was really, really fun conversation. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I know the Zoom is a lot of fun. Hopefully we will be back in person this year in the near future. I will be sending out the recording of this, so you are happy to go back through it. And I'll also include contact information. So if you want to do some commercial real estate deals, you can reach out to Brian. If you want to gut renovate your property, you can reach out to Justin, because they're both amazing resources that are people on my team. So again, thank you everybody so much for coming tonight. It's been an awesome meetup.
Thanks, guys.